Federal raids aren't exactly rare in the United States. You've seen them on TV, you've seen them in crime shows, but this one, it's on another level. Homeland Security stormed into the Hyundai LG joint venture site in Georgia, and the result? The largest single-site immigration enforcement operation in recent memory. We're not talking about a handful of undocumented workers in a shady warehouse. We're talking hundreds of people at a site that was supposed to represent the future of America's clean energy transition. That's like hosting the world's biggest vegan food festival and realizing half your chefs brought steak knives. The symbolism here is huge. This was supposed to be a proud banner moment, a $4.3 billion facility, creating jobs, building batteries to fuel 300,000 electric cars a year. Instead, it got its name etched into history books as the poster child of an immigration crackdown. Federal agents didn't just raid, they made a statement. If you're bending visa rules or skirting the fine print, even a high-profile mega project won't protect you. And let's be real, the optics are chef's kiss. For immigration hardliners, this raid is basically the Super Bowl. For critics, it's a PR nightmare that screams, why are we sabotaging investments in clean tech while the world is competing for EV dominance? Punchline spin. So, yes, congratulations, Georgia Hyundai plant. You're now famous, not for batteries, not for clean energy, but for hosting America's newest entry into the Guinness Book of Immigration Raids. But if the scale of the raid was jaw-dropping, just wait until you hear how many people were actually detained. Spoiler, it makes a packed concert look like amateur hour. So how big was the haul? Picture this, 475 workers detained in one swoop. Out of those, more than 300 were South Korean nationals. Let that sink in for a second. That's not a handful of folks accidentally overstaying their visa. That's an entire community suddenly rounded up and processed. To put it in perspective, 475 people is enough to fill a jumbo jet, pack out a medium-sized concert venue, or, in true Southern style, overflow the bleachers at a Friday night high school football game. Now, instead of cheering touchdowns, those seats are filled with engineers, contractors, and specialists facing immigration paperwork under fluorescent lighting. Not exactly the halftime show they signed up for. What makes this even more striking is the demographic. These weren't people living under the radar for years, working odd jobs. Many were recent arrivals, professionals and specialists brought in to help set up Hyundai's crown jewel EV project. And suddenly, they're standing in line with their passports, facing deportation procedures like they accidentally wandered into the world's strictest airport security checkpoint. For the U.S., this raid sends a blunt message. Nobody is untouchable. Not even hundreds of foreign nationals working at a $4.3 billion project with both American and Korean flags flying out front. For South Korea, the optics are brutal. Watching over 300 of your citizens marched into detention at a U.S. facility doesn't exactly scream special ally treatment. Punchline? Let's be honest, when your workforce looks less like a construction crew and more like a Delta boarding group, you know the raid just made history. But numbers alone don't tell the whole story. What were these folks actually doing there? Well, buckle up, because this is where the visa fine print starts to look like a bad plot twist. Here's the twist that takes this from immigration raid to full-on policy migraine. Most of the detained South Koreans weren't working illegally in the sense you might think. They weren't sneaking into jobs without documents. They were skilled technicians, engineers, and specialists, the kinds of people you'd expect to see on a construction site building high-tech battery facilities. So what's the issue? Their paperwork. Many of these workers were reportedly in the U.S. on short-term business visas, like B-1 or visa waiver programs such as ESTA. Those documents let you attend meetings, inspect equipment, maybe troubleshoot some tech. What they don't let you do is swing a hammer or assemble actual infrastructure. In other words, they were legally in the country, but working outside the narrow lane their visas allowed. Imagine this. You buy a ticket to Disneyland. It lets you walk around, take photos, enjoy the scenery. But the second you hop behind the cotton candy counter and start serving customers, security will politely, or not so politely, escort you out. That's basically what happened here, except instead of cotton candy, it was billion-dollar EV infrastructure. And here's where the sarcasm writes itself. These weren't unskilled laborers. They were people brought in because Hyundai needed their specialized expertise. But immigration law doesn't care if you're screwing in a bolt or debugging a robot. If your visa doesn't say work, then congratulations. You're now Exhibit A in the Department of Homeland Security's biggest sting operation of the decade. Punchline? Turns out the most dangerous tool on a U.S. construction site isn't a chainsaw or nail gun. It's a B-1 visa. And when skilled professionals get detained en masse, you can bet there's going to be some serious international turbulence. Which brings us to our next shocking twist. South Korea didn't just complain, they literally booked a jumbo jet. When hundreds of your citizens suddenly get caught up in the biggest U.S. immigration raid in recent memory, you don't just send a few embassy interns with clipboards. No, South Korea went big. How big? They dispatched a chartered Boeing 747 to Atlanta, ready to repatriate the detained workers. That's right, a literal jumbo jet, like a flying symbol of diplomatic embarrassment. It's not every day you see a sovereign government essentially say, "Pack your bags, folks, we're sending a bus with wings." The move was part logistics, part optics. On the one hand, South Korea needed to bring home a few hundred nationals quickly. On the other, this was a subtle diplomatic signal. We're taking this seriously, and we're not thrilled about it. Think about it. A charter flight like this isn't just about efficiency. It's a statement to the global stage. It screams, this isn't a small issue we can sweep under the rug. This is a diplomatic crisis with receipts, boarding passes, and baggage claim. Imagine if the U.S. had to send a plane to another country to pick up hundreds of Americans arrested for breaking visa rules. Cable news would treat it like the end of the Cold War all over again. The 747 itself is an interesting detail. It's iconic, massive, and unmistakable. When it lands in Atlanta to collect workers, it transforms the raid from a local enforcement story into a global headline. Photos of South Korean nationals boarding a plane under federal watch practically market themselves as symbols of strained U.S.-Korea relations. Punchline? Because nothing says allyship like a one-way charter flight home. Souvenir? Deportation papers. If there's one thing corporations are really good at, it's passing the buck. And Hyundai wasted no time in doing exactly that. Within hours of the raid making headlines, the company issued a crisp, lawyer-approved statement. The detained workers were not direct Hyundai employees. Translation? Don't look at us, we just own the building. This is the kind of PR judo you expect from Fortune 500 companies. Sure, the raid happened on their $4.3 billion site. Sure, the workers were flown into their project, but technically they weren't on Hyundai's payroll. They were employed by subcontractors and third-party firms. And in corporate America, that technicality is basically a get-out-of-jail-free card. It's a classic move. Distance yourself from the problem, promise to cooperate, and pray the headlines move on. Hyundai pledged full compliance with U.S. authorities and stressed that they were reviewing contracts and monitoring partners more closely, which sounds reassuring until you realize it's the same copy-paste line every corporation trots out after a scandal. But here's the kicker. Distancing themselves might help Hyundai avoid direct legal liability, but it doesn't stop the reputational hit. For average Americans reading the news, it doesn't matter if the detained workers were Hyundai employees or Hyundai-adjacent employees. The headline still screams, Hyundai's Georgia plant raided, hundreds detained. End of story. So while Hyundai might dodge a courtroom showdown, they can't dodge the PR optics of being the first EV megaproject to make headlines for immigration raids instead of job creation. Punchline. Hyundai basically said, it wasn't us, it was the subcontractor, which is the corporate version of a kid saying, the dog ate my homework. Cute, but no one's buying it. But if Hyundai's corporate shrug was predictable, what happened back in Seoul was anything but. Spoiler, South Koreans weren't just upset, they were livid. If you think Americans were shocked by the raid, multiply that reaction by 10 and you've got South Korea's response. The images of hundreds of their nationals being detained in a supposed ally nation hit like a diplomatic slap. Politicians were outraged, the media ran wall-to-wall coverage, and everyday citizens started questioning, is this how the U.S. treats its partners? For South Korea, this wasn't just about immigration law. It was about dignity, respect, and trust between two countries that call each other allies. Remember, South Korea is one of America's closest partners in Asia, military ally, trade partner, cultural powerhouse. Seeing their engineers treated like disposable workers? That stung. Commentators in Seoul quickly turned the raid into a national conversation. Some saw it as the U.S. flexing muscle at the expense of a smaller partner. Others worried it would chill investment abroad. And many wondered why there wasn't a smoother, quieter way to resolve this issue without hauling 300 professionals into detention centers. The optics, once again, are brutal. On one side, the U.S. talking about cooperation, free trade, and partnership. On the other, their allies sending a jumbo jet to scoop up citizens who just got cuffed for working on an American project. It looks less like partnership and more like power imbalance. And make no mistake, this kind of incident doesn't fade quietly. South Korean officials demanded explanations, opposition politicians hammered the government for being too soft on Washington, and the public started asking, is America really the friend it claims to be? Because nothing says mutual trust like watching your citizens escorted out of an American factory in a convoy of DHS buses. And if outrage in Seoul wasn't enough, there's another layer to this mess. The real problem isn't just diplomacy, it's visas. And boy, is the U.S. system broken.
Here's where the story zooms out from one raid in Georgia to a much bigger headache. America's visa system is woefully unprepared for global megaprojects like Hyundai's. Let's break it down. A facility worth $4.3 billion, with technology so advanced it looks like it was pulled from a sci-fi flick, doesn't exactly run on elbow grease alone. You need highly trained engineers, technicians, and specialists, the kind of talent that's often flown in from abroad. But here's the kicker. The U.S. doesn't have enough visa categories to handle that demand. The famous H-1B visa, capped, backlogged, and already snapped up by tech firms. The E-2 investor visa, narrow in scope and hard to qualify for unless you've got cash to burn. The B-1 business visa, great for meetings, useless for actual work. And ESTA, don't even think about picking up a wrench under that program. So companies like Hyundai are stuck trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. They fly in workers under short-term visas meant for visiting and consulting, but the reality on the ground requires real hands-on labor. And that's how you end up with 300 South Koreans in orange jumpsuits scratching their heads and wondering how installing equipment suddenly became a deportable offense. From a diplomatic perspective, this is a minefield. South Korea sees it as unfair treatment, while the U.S. frames it as enforcing its laws. Meanwhile, the business world is watching nervously, because if Hyundai's workers can get raided, whose project is safe? Samsung? Toyota? LG? Suddenly, the U.S. doesn't look like a friendly place for foreign direct investment, it looks like a legal booby trap. Punchline, trying to run a global mega project with America's visa system is like trying to download a 4K movie on dial-up internet. Painful, slow, and guaranteed to crash. And just when you thought this was an isolated crackdown, Homeland Security made it clear Georgia was just the beginning. Yep, the raid season trailer just dropped. If you thought the Hyundai raid was a one-time show, think again. According to DHS officials, this was not the end. It was the opening act. The message was crystal clear. More raids are coming, and businesses relying on unauthorized workers should start sweating bullets now. This is enforcement as theater. Raids like this aren't just about the people detained, they're about the shockwaves they send through boardrooms and embassies. When nearly 490 workers are scooped up in Georgia, every foreign CEO with U.S. operations suddenly feels the need to call their HR team and say, hey, maybe double-check those visas, like right now. For the Biden administration, or Trump administration 2.0, depending on when you're watching this, the raid is political gold. It proves toughness on immigration, creates headlines about protecting American jobs, and satisfies a base that's been demanding visible action. But here's the irony. The timing couldn't be worse. The U.S. is simultaneously begging companies to build clean energy plants, promising incentives and touting job creation, while also slamming the door on the skilled workers needed to actually get those plants running. Businesses are panicking. Analysts are warning of delays, and allies like South Korea are wondering if they're next in line for the DHS spotlight. This isn't just immigration enforcement, it's a chilling message that the rules of the game are changing and nobody gets a pass. Punchline? It's like the government saying, "Welcome to America, land of opportunity. Now hand over your passports and step into this van." And that brings us to the final and juiciest question: what happens to Hyundai's mega project now? Spoiler, those shiny EV batteries might be stuck on pause.
So after all the raids, the tweets, the jumbo jet, and the diplomatic fireworks, here's the scratch that, $4.3 billion question. What happens to Hyundai's mega battery plant now? On paper, this site was supposed to be a game changer. A facility cranking out enough batteries to power 300,000 EVs every year, boosting America's clean energy supply chain and creating thousands of U.S. jobs. Georgia was hyped. Hyundai was hyped. Even Washington was hyped. But raids have a funny way of turning hype into headaches. The immediate fear? Delays. Construction projects run on timelines tighter than your favorite jeans after Thanksgiving. Yank out hundreds of skilled workers mid-build, and suddenly deadlines look more like wishful thinking. Every day lost translates into millions in costs, angry investors, and a ripple effect through the EV supply chain. The bigger fear? Trust. For Hyundai, this project was proof that foreign firms could pour billions into the U.S. and be welcomed as partners. Instead, they're watching their people marched into detention centers and sent home on a charter plane. That's not exactly the hallmark moment they signed up for. If the message South Korea takes home is, "America doesn't play fair," future investments could take a serious hit. And then there's the global context. China is already dominating EV battery production. Europe is scrambling to catch up. The U.S. was hoping to leapfrog into the race with projects like this one. But if legal red tape and immigration raids become the norm, don't be surprised if the Made in America battery dream starts sputtering before it even hits the road. The Georgia Hyundai plant was supposed to charge America's EV future. Instead, it might just end up as a case study on how to short-circuit your allies.